The wind, a restless spirit on the vast open plains, whispered tales of hardship and survival through the sparse grasses of the Crow encampment. It was a sound Vevina knew as well as her own heartbeat, a constant companion in a life that had often felt as stark and lonely as the winter landscapes. The year was 1872, a time when the old ways were increasingly shadowed by the encroachment of a new world, yet here, traditions held a fierce, sometimes brutal, grip. Vevina, a woman whose quiet demeanor often mistook for meekness, moved through the camp with an observant stillness. Her own sorrow, a tightly guarded ember from the loss of her younger brother to a fever that swept through their lodges 2 winters past, had carved a space of introspection within her, setting her slightly apart from the boisterous camaraderie of her kin. She possessed a healer's touch, a skill inherited from her grandmother, and though her remedies were sought, her presence often felt like that of a gentle shade at the edge of the firelight. The camp itself was a temporary constellation of hide lodges, nestled in a shallow river valley that offered some protection from the elements. But the air was not easy. Tension coiled like a serpent among the people. Scouts had reported Comanche war parties moving with unnerving boldness near their hunting grounds, and the memory of recent clashes was a raw wound. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant call of a hawk a potential warning. Vevina felt this unease in the tightness of her shoulders, in the way the elders' voices were low and grave around the council fire. Her routine, gathering herbs in the quietude of the riverbanks or preparing poultices in the small lodge she shared with an aging aunt, was a fragile dam against the rising tide of communal anxiety. Then, the warriors returned, not with the triumphant calls of a successful hunt, but with a grim, restrained energy that sent a shiver through the camp. In their midst, bound and bleeding, was a man, a Comanche. His name, they would later learn from his own defiant utterances, was Chayton. He was tall, even when forced to stumble, his black hair matted with dust and blood, his dark eyes burning with an unquenched fire despite the obvious pain that racked his body. He had been taken after a fierce skirmish, the lone survivor of his raiding party, his capture a hard-won prize. Vevina watched from the periphery as he was dragged towards the center of the camp, near the main fire pit. His wounds were severe. A deep gash on his shoulder oozed blood, and his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. Yet, he made no sound of suffering, only contempt for his captors. The decision of the council, led by the stern war chief Moketavato, was swift and brutal, delivered in tones that brooked no dissent. The Comanche would be made an example. At dawn he would face the slow death, a warning to any others who dared trespass. A cold dread settled in Vevina's stomach. She had seen such justice before, understood the ancient enmities that fueled it, the need for retribution in a world where survival was a constant battle. But as she looked at Chayton, at the proud set of his jaw even in defeat, at the flicker of something profoundly human and unbroken in his gaze, a different feeling stirred within her. It was not pity, not entirely. It was a disquieting recognition, a faint echo of her own carefully concealed pain. He was an enemy, yes, a raider who would have shown her people no mercy. Yet, the thought of his prolonged agony under the rising sun filled her with a profound, almost physical sickness. That night, the camp was restless. Victory drums beat a somber rhythm, but it was a celebration laced with the anticipation of a grim spectacle. Vevina lay on her sleeping furs, the sounds outside her lodge a torment. Sleep was impossible. The image of Chayton's eyes, fierce and enduring, seemed imprinted on the darkness behind her eyelids. He was tied to a sturdy post near the dying embers of the communal fire, left to the chill of the night and the torment of his injuries. The wind carried his occasional ragged breaths to her, a reminder of his dwindling time. An impulse, sharp and undeniable, rose within her. It was madness. It was a betrayal of her people, a risk beyond imagining. If discovered, she would face ostracization, perhaps even a fate similar to the one she sought to prevent. But the image of her brother, his small hand clutching hers as the fever stole his life, surfaced in her mind. She had been helpless then. Perhaps, she thought with a surge of desperate resolve, she did not have to be helpless now. Moving with the silence she had cultivated over years of solitary wanderings, Vevina slipped from her lodge. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, for which she was grateful. She carried a small water skin and a bundle of freshly pounded willow bark and comfrey root, sovereign remedies for pain and bleeding. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a drum of warning. Chayton was a slumped silhouette against the faintly glowing ashes. His head was bowed, but as she approached, it lifted slowly, his eyes, even in the gloom, finding hers with an unnerving intensity. She saw suspicion flare there, and a weary, animalistic caution. He expected more torment, perhaps, a final taunt before the dawn. She knelt a respectful distance away, her movements slow and deliberate. She offered the water skin. "Water," she whispered, the crow word soft, almost carried away by the breeze. He stared at it, then at her, his gaze unwavering. For a long moment he did nothing. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he leaned forward as much as his bonds allowed. Vevina carefully brought the spout to his cracked lips. He drank deeply, his throat working. The simple act felt monumental, a bridge across a chasm of hatred. Next, she held up the poultice. "For your wounds," she said, her voice still a low murmur. She gestured to his bleeding shoulder. He watched her, his expression unreadable. There was no gratitude, no softening, only that relentless assessing gaze. He clearly did not trust her. Why should he? She was one of the enemy who would see him die. Yet, he did not resist when she gently, carefully, began to clean the edges of the gash with water from her skin, then applied the soothing herbs. His muscles were rigid beneath her touch, his breath hissing softly through his teeth as the poultice made contact with raw flesh, but he remained still. His silence was as profound as any words. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She rebandaged his shoulder with a strip of hide she had brought. She could do little for his leg, save for trying to position it more comfortably, but the bone was clearly broken. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, generations of conflict, the freshness of his capture, the looming certainty of his death. When she had done all she could, she rose, her task complete. He watched her, a flicker of something she could not name. Confusion? Grudging respect? In his dark eyes before they shuttered again into stoic reserve. She retreated as silently as she had come, the weight of her secret a heavy stone in her chest. The following day, Chayton was still alive, though weaker. The elders, Mokatavato among them, seemed to relish the delay, seeing it as more time for his spirit to break. Vevina went about her chores, her face a mask of normalcy, but her senses were heightened. She listened to the talk in the camp, the cruel speculation, the anticipation. And she saw the slow, agonizing decline of the prisoner. The sun beat down, and he was given no water, no shade. That night, she returned. Again, the water skin, fresh poultices. This time, he accepted the water with less hesitation. As she tended his wounds, which were beginning to fester in the prairie heat, their eyes met more often. She saw not just an enemy warrior, but a man enduring immense suffering with a pride that was both admirable and heartbreaking. He still said nothing, but his breathing seemed to ease slightly when she was near, as if her presence, however inexplicable, offered a sliver of solace in his torment. She started bringing him small morsels of food, a piece of dried meat, a handful of berries, concealed in her dress. It was a desperate act, prolonging what seemed inevitable, but she could not stop herself. Each furtive visit was a gamble, each shared glance, each moment of silent communion, wove an invisible thread between them. She learned the rhythm of the camp's sleep, the patterns of the guards, who grew lax as the prisoner weakened. One evening she overheard Mokatavato and other senior warriors discussing Chayton. "He is tougher than he looks," one said, a grudging admiration in his voice. "But he will break. Tomorrow, we will begin in earnest." Mokatavato's voice was cold. "His screams will be a song for our ancestors." A chill ran down Vevina's spine. The casual cruelty of it, the certainty, galvanized her. She could not let it happen. That night, when she went to Chayton, there was a new urgency in her actions. She had a plan, born of desperation and a growing, terrifying protectiveness. There was a place she knew, a network of small caves hidden in a rocky outcrop a few miles from the camp, a place she had stumbled upon as a girl and kept secret. It was a faint hope, a dangerous one. "I will help you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There is a place, safe." She used a mixture of crow words and gestures, trying to convey her intent. Chayton stared at her, his eyes narrowed. Doubt and a nascent, fragile trust warred in his expression. To flee with an enemy woman into unknown territory was a desperate gamble. But to stay meant certain, agonizing death. She had brought a small, sharp flint knife. Working in the deepest shadows, her fingers fumbling with a mixture of fear and haste, she began to saw at the thick hide ropes that bound his wrists. It was slow, painstaking work. Twice, a guard stirred nearby, and she froze, her breath caught in her throat, Chayton equally still beside her. Finally, one rope gave way, then the other. His hands were free, raw and chafed. Getting him to his feet was another challenge. He was incredibly weak, his injured leg useless. He leaned heavily on her, his arm around her shoulder, his breath hot against her ear. Every movement was an agony for him. She could feel the tremors that shook his body. She was not a large woman, and his weight was considerable, but a desperate strength flowed through her. Their escape was a terrifying, slow-motion journey through the sleeping camp. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of a coyote, sounded like an alarm. Vevina guided him, her knowledge of the camp's layout her only advantage. She half carried, half dragged him, her muscles screaming in protest, her lungs burning. Chayton, despite his weakness, moved with a warrior's instinct for silence, his good leg taking his weight when he could, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness. They reached the edge of the camp, then the open prairie. The stars seemed unnaturally bright, exposing them. She led him towards the rocky outcrop, the journey taking what felt like an eternity. Finally, breathless and exhausted, they reached the narrow entrance to the caves, concealed behind a curtain of wild vines. She helped him inside, into the cool, damp darkness. He collapsed onto the cave floor, his breathing harsh and shallow. Vevina lit a small, carefully hoarded piece of tallow with her flint and steel. The flickering light revealed a small, dry chamber. She had, in previous days, furtively stocked it with a few supplies: a water skin, some dried food, more herbs. Chayton watched her, his face etched with pain and exhaustion, but in his eyes there was a new light, a dawning realization of the magnitude of her sacrifice. The discovery of his escape threw the Crow camp into an uproar at dawn. Mokotavato was incandescent with rage. He had been cheated of his vengeance. How could a man so near death, so tightly bound, simply vanish? Some whispered of powerful medicine, of spirits aiding an enemy. Others, more practical, suspected a traitor. A thorough search was organized. Warriors fanned out, their anger a palpable wave across the land. Vevina returned to the camp just before the alarm was raised, her clothes torn, her body aching, but her face composed. She feigned surprise and fear along with the others. Inside, her heart pounded. She lived a double life, by day the quiet healer, by night the secret guardian of an enemy warrior. She tended to Chayton in the cave, sneaking away whenever she could, bringing food, water, and fresh dressings for his wounds. His fever was high for several days, and she feared he would die there, in the damp earth, so far from his own people. She sponged his hot skin, forced broth between his lips, and spoke to him in low, soothing tones, words he did not understand but whose intent he seemed to grasp. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to mend. The gash on his shoulder started to heal, the fire of infection in his eyes receded. His leg, she knew, would always be crooked, but he was alive. During those long hours in the dim cave, a strange intimacy grew between them. Words were still few. His Crow was non-existent, her Comanche limited to a few phrases she'd picked up over years of intertribal friction. They communicated through gestures, through expressions, through the shared vulnerability of their situation. She saw the lines of pain around his eyes soften when she changed his dressings. He would watch her with an intensity that made her flush, a look that held gratitude, respect, and something more, something that mirrored the confusing, powerful emotions stirring in her own heart. One afternoon, as she was grinding herbs, he reached out and touched her hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle. He said a word in Comanche, his voice raspy. She didn't understand it, but the tone was soft. She looked at him, and for the first time, saw not the fierce warrior, but the man, stripped of his defenses, reliant on her mercy. And in his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness, her own longing for connection. The search parties came close to the caves several times. On one terrifying occasion, Vevina was inside with Chayton when she heard voices and the scrape of boots on rock just outside the hidden entrance. They froze, Chayton instinctively trying to pull her behind him, his hand gripping a sharpened stone he now kept by his side. They remained motionless, barely breathing, until the sounds receded. The shared danger, the silent promise of protection, bound them tighter. As Chayton regained strength, the reality of their situation pressed in on Vevina. He could not stay in the cave forever. Soon he would be strong enough to travel. And then what? Would he return to his people, to the life of a warrior, an enemy? The thought left an unexpected ache in her chest. She had saved him, but in doing so, she had become inextricably linked to him. The camp was no longer a safe place for her. Suspicion, like a creeping vine, was beginning to wind its way towards her. Her frequent absences, her knowledge of healing herbs that could have sustained a fugitive, her quiet, watchful nature, small things perhaps, but Moketavato was a shrewd man, his gaze increasingly sharp when it fell upon her. One evening Chayton spoke, his voice stronger now. He used a mixture of sign and the few crow words she had taught him. "You risk much," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Why?" Vevina looked away, towards the dying light filtering through the cave entrance. How could she explain the impulse that had set her on this path? The weariness of endless conflict, the memory of her brother's gentle spirit, the unexpected recognition of humanity in an enemy's eyes. "I did not want to see more death," she managed, the words inadequate. But then, meeting his gaze, she added with a truth that surprised even herself, "I saw you, not just Comanche." A new understanding passed between them. He reached for her hand again, his calloused palm warm against hers. He held it for a long moment, a silent acknowledgment of the bond that had formed in shared secrecy and peril. The day came when Moketavato summoned Vevina to the council fire. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, cold and hard. "The Comanche dog had help," he stated, not a question but an accusation. "Someone within our camp betrayed us, someone with knowledge of healing perhaps, someone who moves like a shadow." Vevina's blood ran cold, but she met his gaze, her own carefully veiled. "I know nothing of this, war chief," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. Moketavato was not convinced. He spoke of her solitary ways, her gathering of herbs far from the camp. He did not accuse her directly, not yet, but the threat hung heavy in the air. "The spirits of our fallen warriors cry out for justice," he said, his voice resonating with anger. "The traitor will be found, and they will pay." Vevina knew her time was running out. That night, she went to the cave with a heavy heart. Chayton was almost fully recovered, moving with a warrior's grace despite his limp. He saw the distress in her eyes immediately. "They suspect," she told him. "I cannot stay, and you must go, far from here." He listened, his expression grim. "And you?" he asked, his voice low. "Where will you go?" She had no answer. To be cast out from her tribe was a death of another kind. Loneliness, a familiar companion, threatened to engulf her. She looked at Chayton, at the man whose life she had saved, the man who had, in turn, awakened something in her she thought long dead. The thought of him leaving, of returning to a world where they were enemies, was unbearable. It was in that moment, with the cold certainty of her own impending doom pressing in, that she realized the full depth of her feelings. It wasn't just compassion, or a sense of responsibility. It was something far more profound, more terrifying. She loved him. She, Vevina of the Crow, loved Chayton, the Comanche warrior, and she couldn't let him go, not without her. "I will come with you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. Chayton stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a fierce, possessive light. "Your people." "I will have no people if I stay," she said, a bitter truth. "My life here is over. If you will have me, I will go with you." A slow smile spread across Chayton's face, transforming his usually stern features. He stepped forward, taking both her hands in his. "Have you?" he repeated softly in his own tongue. Then, switching to their broken mix of languages, "Vevina, you are my medicine, my life. With you, I am not alone." Their plan was to leave under the cover of the next moonless night, heading south, towards lands neither of them knew, hoping to find a place where they could live in peace. away from the bitter feuds of their tribes. But fate, or perhaps Mokotavato's relentless suspicion, intervened. The following afternoon, as Vevina was making her final furtive preparations, she saw Mokotavato and 2 of his most trusted warriors heading towards the rocky outcrop. Her heart leaped into her throat. They knew. Or they suspected enough to investigate the one place she had always kept secret. She raced towards the caves, heedless of the watching eyes in the camp, her only thought to warn Chayton. She burst through the vine-covered entrance, breathless. "They come, Mokotavato. We must go now." Chayton was instantly alert. He grabbed his meager belongings, a knife, a water skin. But as they reached the cave mouth, Mokotavato and his warriors were already there, blocking the exit, their faces grim. "So," Mokotavato said, his voice like the scrape of stone on stone, his eyes fixed on Vevina. "The shadow has a name, and a companion." He looked at Chayton with undisguised hatred. "The Comanche dog still lives, tended by a traitorous crow woman." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Vevina, but something else rose with it, a defiant courage she didn't know she possessed. She stepped in front of Chayton, shielding him with her body. "He is no longer your prisoner, Mokotavato," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "And I am no traitor. I chose life over death." "You chose an enemy of our people over your own blood," Mokotavato snarled. "You will die with him." He raised his war club. But Chayton moved, pushing Vevina gently aside, stepping forward to face Mokotavato. He was unarmed, save for the small flint knife, but he stood tall, his gaze meeting the war chief's without flinching, despite his noticeable limp. "She saved my life," Chayton said, his crow words heavily accented but clear. "I was an enemy. She showed me mercy. Something your warriors forget." He glanced at Vevina, a look of profound love and gratitude in his eyes. "If you kill her, you kill me. But know this, she is more honorable than any of you." Mokotavato hesitated, his arm still raised. The 2 warriors behind him shifted uneasily. Vevina's act was a betrayal, yes, but Chayton's defense of her, his willingness to die for her, gave them pause. There was a code, even in war, and this was something different. Vevina spoke again, her voice ringing with conviction. "Is there not enough killing, enough hatred? He was beaten, near death. What honor is there in torturing a dying man? I offered him water and healing. Is that so wrong? If this makes me an outcast, then I will be an outcast. But I will not stand by and watch needless cruelty. I could not let him die then, and I cannot let him go now, not to your vengeance." She looked directly at Mokotavato. "I claim him. I will leave with him. Banish me if you must, but let there be an end to this." The silence stretched, taut and heavy. Mokotavato lowered his club slowly. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, and perhaps a flicker of something akin to grudging respect for Vevina's courage, for Chayton's defiance. He looked from Vevina to Chayton, then back to Vevina. He had lost a son in a Comanche raid years ago. His hatred for them was a deep, bitter well. But Vevina was one of his own, the daughter of a respected hunter, a skilled healer. Finally, he spoke, his voice harsh, but without the immediate threat of violence. "You have shamed your ancestors, Vevina. You have chosen an enemy over your people. You are no longer Crow." The words were like a physical blow, but Vevina stood firm, Chayton a solid presence beside her. "Take him." Mokotavato spat, gesturing at Chayton with contempt. "Leave this place. If you are ever seen in Crow lands again, you will both die. This is my judgment." Relief, immense and overwhelming, washed over Vevina, so potent it almost buckled her knees. Chayton's hand found hers, his grip strong and reassuring. They had a chance. A slim, perilous chance, but a chance nonetheless. They left the cave, walking past Mokotavato and his warriors, who watched them with stony faces. No one in the camp spoke to them as they gathered Vevina's few belongings from her lodge. The silence of her people was a heavy cloak, a final, painful severance. But as they walked away from the Crow encampment, heading south into the vast, unknown prairie, Vevina did not look back. Her past lay behind her, a path of sorrow and duty. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but she faced it not alone, but with the man whose life she had saved, the man who had, in turn, saved her from a different kind of death. the slow erosion of her spirit. Their journey was arduous. They faced harsh weather, scarcity of food, and the constant threat of discovery by unfriendly patrols from various tribes, or even by white settlers whose presence was a growing shadow on the land. But they faced it together. Chayton's warrior skills, his knowledge of tracking and survival, complemented Vevina's healing arts and her quiet resilience. They learned each other's languages, haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency, their words weaving a new tapestry of shared understanding. They learned the landscape of each other's hearts, the silent sorrows and unspoken hopes. Months turned into a year. They traveled far, seeking a place where the wars did not reach, a hidden sanctuary where they could build a life. And one day, they found it. A small, fertile valley, nestled between protective mesas, a clear stream running through it, abundant with game and wild plants. It felt like a gift from the Great Spirit, a place of peace. Here, they built a small lodge, a home forged from their shared labor and mutual devotion. Vevina planted a garden with seeds she had carefully carried. Chayton hunted, his limp a constant reminder of their past, but his spirit whole and content. The sharp edges of Vevina's old griefs had softened, smoothed by the balm of Chayton's love and the quiet rhythm of their new life. She no longer felt like a shade at the edge of the firelight. She was the warmth itself, her laughter now more frequent than her tears. Chayton, who had lost his tribe and his place as a warrior, found a new tribe in Vevina, a new purpose in the love they shared. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, as the stars blazed in the immense dark sky, Vevina would look at Chayton, his strong profile softened by the firelight, and a profound sense of peace would fill her. She had rescued a prisoner, an enemy, driven by an instinct she hadn't fully understood. And in doing so, she had found her own salvation, her own belonging. She had realized she couldn't let him go, and in that moment of defiant love, she had chosen not just his life, but her own. A life richer and more meaningful than any she could have imagined within the confines of her old world. Their love story, born in the shadow of death and prejudice, was a quiet testament to the resilience of the human heart and the unexpected paths to connection. The wind still whispered across the plains, but now, for Vevina and Chayton, it carried not just tales of hardship, but also the enduring promise of hope.